Recently, I've been talking a lot about Toxic Rain Raider. This build was my league starter, and so today I'm going to be doing a guide. Now, I already leveled the character from level 1 into maps on stream. I also covered a lot of the early game gearing and a lot of what I did. Those will all be down in the description below, along with some resources on how I play the build and why you shouldn't be using Focus Ballista. This guide is going to focus more on the gearing itself and the endgame, because those are the topics that I haven't covered as much. And a quick disclaimer before I get into the video. Prices change all the time. If I mention a number like, oh, I paid 3x for this, unless it's something I'm paying to the crafting bench, it could end up being 20c, it could end up being 20x. I have no way to know, especially because by making this video, there's probably going to be an impact on pricing. So to start with, is Toxic Rain Raider a good league starter, and should you use Ballista or should you go self-attack? It's absolutely a great league starter. There's never a point where I felt like the build and the skill choice was holding me back. You could go self-attack, but self-attack is going to be more mana hungry, and you're going to have a lot less DPS in the early stages of the game. One thing that I really love about Ballistas is I can just drop them and run past enemies without having to worry about staying and making sure the thing is dead. Similarly, on boss fights, this allows me to run circles around bosses, dodging their mechanics very efficiently, without having to worry nearly as much as I would otherwise about attacking them. The only things that are actively attacking a lot of the time are my Mirage Archer, which for general mapping will be Caustic Arrow, on specific bosses will be Toxic Rain, and the Ballistas themselves. I also wanted to take a moment to address a concern that I've heard from some people about their Ballistas dying. Overall, I did not experience this very often. I think this probably comes from having too low of a level of a ballista support, in combination with dropping ballistas directly on yourself and then standing there, as opposed to dropping them as you run away. Because if you drop them all in a little cluster, and then you stand there, and the boss uses an attack on you, then even if you dodge, it's going to hit all the ballistas. Whereas if you run in a circle, dropping them as you go, it might hit 1 or 2 ballista, and most of your damage still gets out. The only time that I personally ran into my ballistas dying a significant amount was when I did the hidden, because as it turns out, the invulnerable Esh clone was very, very good at killing ballistas. But as the hidden isn't something that this build is really made to farm, this is a league starter, so what it's really made to do is get you up and running, get you into maps and all that, progress your atlas. That's not a huge concern to me, and I did still kill the hidden despite not being optimized for it. In fact, I've killed most bosses in the game. The only really notable one that I have not done at least once is the Feared, and that's because I haven't gotten a Cortex drop and I haven't bought one because I don't really want to waste the money. But assuming that I get a Cortex drop before I move on to my next build, I will definitely be doing the Feared as well on this character. And that gets me into the second big point. This build is not optimized for bossing. It can do it. It's pretty good at doing bossing, but it's not made for it. It's really made for mapping and clearing maps quickly and efficiently on very little gear. So if you like any of these things, then I suggest sticking around as I talk about, first, some of the mechanics involved in the build, then moving on to the itemization and how I geared it. This look at the Toxic Rain Raider was brought to you in part due to the generous support of my YouTube channel members and patrons. More on how you can support at the end. So the first mechanic that I want to talk about quickly is my defensive flasks. This build does not have a ton of physical mitigation. I probably should have physical mitigation on my helmet and chest. At the moment I don't, because I'm very comfortable with my ability to dodge things. You probably should. The +1 active gem on the chest does not add a ton of damage. It's not super important. But defensive flask-wise, I'm using a Forbidden Taste to recover full life on use. It's used when I take a savage hit. This means if I take a hit that does not kill me, I will instantly heal to full. I'm combining this with a Taste of Hate, so that when I take a savage hit, I also gain a fairly significant amount of fizz reduction with the fizz from hits taken as cold during flask effect. This is to help shore up the lack of fizz defenses. Now, the next defensive mechanic that ties into this is Divine Flesh. Divine Flesh causes 50% of elemental damage to be taken as chaos, and increases my max chaos res by 5%. In combination with a Board of Chaos Cluster and my Quiver, I have 85% chaos res. So ideally, I should have fizz taken as chaos on my chest, which would mitigate a very significant portion of the fizz damage that I'm taking. Avoidance is great, and I am using a blind on hit jewel in combination with Raider stuff, to have a high amount of avoidance up most of the time. If I wanted, I could use a Net Series step to enhance this further. The reason I'm using rare boots is I couldn't meet my resists without the boots that I have. But when you have a high avoidance character, you do need some damage reduction and some damage mitigation. Part of it's Wind Dancer. However, the flasks help to shore that up, along with endurance charges from Enduring Cry. Moving on, some of the damage mechanics that are important is why am I not using Concentrated Effect or Focus Ballistas? Well, if you want to see why I'm not using Focus Ballista, I have a video for that, which will be down below. If you want to know why I'm not using Conc Effect, the main reason is, yes, it is more damage against stationary enemies. So something like Sirus, I could easily use Conc Effect and I would gain DPS. He doesn't really move around. The more an enemy moves, the less time they spend within the relatively small radius of a Toxic Rain taking damage. And this starts to feel really bad, especially against a highly mobile enemy like Varana. This is also why I use the +1 projectile helm enchant. Really, regardless of the number of projectiles or how much AoE you have, you will get 4 overlaps with high consistency. It's very difficult to go from 4 to 5, and it's equally difficult to go from 4 to 3. But the extra projectile falling in that circle means there's a greater chance of an enemy that happens to moving into my Toxic Rain rather than just moving out of them. So instead I opted to go with the standard route of Toxic Rain, Vicious Projectiles, Ballista Totem, Awakened Void Manipulation, Anomalous Efficacy for extra duration, and an Empower. If you can't afford the Empower, it is totally fine to put a Conc Effect in, and technically Conc Effect against stationary enemies will be more damage than Vicious Projectiles if you don't mind a gem swap, and have a white socket to swap between a green and a blue gem. In terms of clearing, I don't use the Ballistas all that often. Instead I use Caustic Arrow with Arrow Nova. The support gems in my case are a little bit weird. I am using a Decay support, which is far from traditional. The reason I'm doing that is I like switching into a second Toxic Rain setup for bosses like Sirus, and it's really hard to find a good blue support gem for Caustic Arrow. So if you want to be optimal, you should absolutely take that out and put in something like Awakened Void Manipulation instead, and use either 5 green or 6 green sockets for your Caustic Arrow links. The last thing I want to talk about offensively is the cluster jewels. I'm using a large cluster into 2 mediums into 1 small. I could, if I wanted, replace the other jewel with a Fettle cluster to get a bit more life. However, I felt like my life was overall fine as is, and I was struggling to find enough sockets to put all the jewels I wanted in my build. Unspeakable Gifts won't show up as the most DPS. If you want the most DPS, it's Unholy Grace. And for single target, Unholy Grace is better. But Unspeakable Gifts is really nice because it adds a little bit of Explode, which I found to smooth out the clearing significantly. The last thing I want to touch on offensively is my Glorious Vanity uses a Ritual of Shadows. This means that my Wither uptime is far, far, far more reliable. And that's why I'm not using a Cluster Jewel with a chance to inflict Wither on hit if you have 5 or less on the enemy. I do use Withering Step to pump up those stacks, but it's a noticeable improvement to get at least 1 Ritual of Shadows in your build. And now, moving on, I wanted to talk about some of the itemization, and most specifically, how I made some of these items. So I'm not going to be covering absolutely everything here. A good example of this is most of my normal jewels I just bought. There's no special magic technique that I use to roll them. When it comes to the cluster jewels, I did a mix of buying some of the cheaper ones, like the Born of Chaos cluster, along with using aberrant fossils to roll the bases. Be sure to pay attention to the item level, as for example on the large cluster it needs to be 75 or higher to be able to roll Unspeakable Gift. For the bow, there's a couple things you can do. You can Alt-Aug Regal and get the chaos damage over time with damage over time multiplier. You could also do what I did, which was buy a bunch of bases that people had for sale with the 2 mods and a bunch of junk mods, and annul until you get lucky. Doing that, it cost me about 7x to isolate the chaos damage over time and damage over time multiplier, along with 6 length of bow. I then did can have multiple crafted mods, cannot roll attack mods, slam to put the +1 gems on, removed the crafted mods, redid can have up to 3 crafted modifiers, +2 to level of socketed supports, and chaos damage over time multiplier. The total cost for this was about 15 exalts, but for me it's well worth it, and from what I can see on the open market, these bows are going for about 25x, so I saved a significant portion of money. I ended up buying both rings, not because there's any specific need to. They're not super hard to roll. One's just a resist ring with life, and the other can easily be rolled with Harvest via Caster Reforge. I just happened to find, at a good price, the exact resists that I needed, so I didn't bother. Similarly with my belt, I did end up buying it because I was trying to roll Strength, Max Life, and Chaos Res using Essences of Envy, and what ended up happening was I bought about 3x worth of belts and essences. I rolled a bunch of belts and I sold them for 6x. And then I found a belt for 2 exalts that had the stats that I needed. So I just used the money from my crafting to buy that before I actually hit the item. The gloves are made with an Awakener's Orb. You combine Chaos Damage over Time Multiplier with Culling Strike, and you hope for good prefixes and good suffixes. In my case, the projectile attack damage is okay. Overall, they're pretty mediocre and one of the weaker parts of my gear. The boots I did buy, I needed the resist, I needed the Chaos Res, move speed's good, and I needed the open suffix to be Elite Void Cap. You could instead have Elia Void on your chest piece and use a Net Series step if you don't need the resists. The quiver, I ended up crafting with Aberrant Pristine Fossils, but I do feel your best bet is probably just to spam Aberrant Fossils. This was another one where I crafted a bunch of items, I ended up selling the ones I didn't use for a significant profit, and I kept the best one, which is what I'm using now. For my helmet, I bought a Hunter Influence Base with Toxic Rain Fires an additional arrow. From there, I rolled it with Aberrant Fossils until I got the -9, and I ended up hitting 47 int, which was pretty good for my build. I then did Suffixes Cannot Be Changed and put on a Veiled Chaos. My hope was to hit a suffix, which I did. This is about a 50-50 chance. I did get somewhat lucky here. There's plenty of good veiled prefixes though, so I wouldn't have been too mad if I'd hit a prefix. In fact though, the prefixes were pretty junk, so I again did Suffixes Cannot Be Changed, and then did a simple Harvest Reforge for life mods to get the extra life. I was hoping for flat life so I could put Fizz Taken as fire on it. Didn't quite get what I wanted, but it's good enough. Which leaves the amulet. These amulets, when I last made mine, were super expensive. They were about 20x. They've come down since then. I don't know where it'll be after this video though. So what I did is I ended up purchasing an amulet with 85 max life plus 1 to all chaos skill gems. It happened to have a Fizz to attacks, which is just a dead mod. I then did Prefixes Cannot Be Changed and used a Harvest Reforge for chaos to put the chaos damage over time multiplier on it. Now be warned, you can instead hit chaos res, and on my first couple tries, I did. It seems to be about a 50-50 shot between chaos res and chaos damage over time multiplier. So be sure to budget for about a 4 to 6x investment if you're going to roll Chaos.Multi on your amulet this way. Chaos.Multi is really icing on the cake. You don't need it. I used a much cheaper amulet that did actually have chaos res and attributes as the suffixes and crafted life for a long time, and it was totally fine. I just really wanted that feeling of finishing out the build with all the extra shinies. So those are some details on my gearing and how I got each of the items, which I hope you find helpful. So in closing, my thoughts are that this is an excellent League Starter build and just a good, well-rounded build. If you're looking for something to progress your Atlas, to play the game at your own pace, and to not have to worry a ton about monsters because you're also slowing them with your main damage skill, Toxic Rain is great. It's still one of the most reliable League Starters. It's still super easy to scale. There's no required items here. It's not like you need this or that. You don't have to get your Void Battery before your build is viable. I don't think it's the best choice for everyone. If your goal is exclusively bossing, this probably isn't the best choice for you. I'd go for something like Forbidden Rite Totems or Max Block Gladiator instead, as those will have significantly better options, either A, to burst the boss down, or B, to face tank the boss. Similarly, if your goal is heavy delirious content, super heavy juicing, going as fast as possible, you've got an Orbot friend, this build isn't great because it just doesn't scale up to that level since you can't use most auras on it. Instead, you want something that's probably base Fizz, something like Penance Brand, that'll clear those delirious maps like they were normal. But for most players and most situations, this build's great, and I genuinely enjoyed it. I'm not quite sure what I'll be doing next, but I can safely recommend Toxic Rain Ballista Raider. And what about you? What have your experiences been, and did you feel overly punished in your League start choice because you started one of the bad skills like Reaper, or did you have a super smooth and successful run like I did to the point where you barely noticed the nerfs? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. A special thanks to my YouTube channel members and patrons, whose generous support keeps me from needing to accept sketchy mobile game sponsorships. If you want the best way to keep up with my video releases and live streams, or maybe just hang out and chat with a bunch of like-minded people, be sure to join the Discord. You can find all these links down in the description below. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great day.